He was the most powerful man on the planet, a monarch who reigned over a global empire where the sun never set. Yet in the silent corridors of Windsor Castle, he was a prisoner, strapped to a chair and left to scream at walls that couldn't answer. History remembers George III as the mad king who lost the American colonies, but the truth hidden in his medical records is far more disturbing than a mere mental breakdown. It was a genetic disaster, a biological poison that turned his urine purple, his skin into a map of sores, and his mind into a chaotic storm. Behind the gilded facade of the 18th century British court, a king was being tortured in the name of medicine, and a dynasty was collapsing from the inside out. This is not just a story of madness, it is the clinical record of a royal bloodline reaching its breaking point. The facade of perfection. For nearly 30 decades, George III was the picture of stability. He was Farmer George, a king who preferred the company of scientists and the peace of his gardens to the decadent intrigues of London. He was a devoted husband to Queen Charlotte, fathering 15 children and creating what seemed to be the most stable royal household in Europe. He guided his nation through the Enlightenment, collected vast libraries, and saw the British Empire become the undisputed master of the seas. But even during these golden years, the seeds of his destruction were already sown. A phantom was lurking in his DNA, a rare hereditary metabolic disorder that was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The first fracture. The year was 1788 when the golden mask finally shattered. It didn't start with madness, but with physical agony. The king complained of excruciating abdominal pains that left him doubled over, his pulse racing like a hunted animal. Then the symptoms took a sinister turn. The measured, precise speech for which the king was known vanished. In its place came the garrulity, a relentless 19-hour stream of consciousness where the king spoke until his voice failed and foam flecked his lips. His eyes became unusually bright, bloodshot and wild, staring at things no one else could see. The court was paralyzed. Was it the stress of the revolution in America, or was the king losing his soul? The oak tree incident. The whispers became a roar of scandal after a fateful day in Windsor Park. The king, walking with his attendants, suddenly approached a massive oak tree. To the horror of his equerries, the king began to address the tree with the utmost gravity, believing he was speaking with the King of Prussia. He shook a low-hanging branch as if it were a royal hand, engaging in a lengthy diplomatic conversation with the wood and bark. It was the moment the world realized the ruler of the British Empire was no longer in command of his senses. The palace doors were bolted, the curtains were drawn, and the farmer king was spirited away to Kew Palace, hidden from the public eye, to undergo a treatment that would be more horrific than the disease itself. The blood of kings. What the doctors of the 1700s couldn't understand was that George's madness was written in his very blood. Modern scientists, analyzing his symptoms and hair samples, point to porphyria, a rare genetic condition that disrupts the production of heme. When the king's body failed to process these chemicals, they turned into a neurotoxic poison, attacking his nervous system and his brain. One of the most terrifying telltale signs was the color of the king's urine. It was reported to be deep red or even purple. In an era of superstition, this blue blood gone wrong was seen as a divine curse. But for George, it was the start of a decades-long descent into a living nightmare where he would become a puppet for his ambitious son and a laboratory rat for the most brutal medical minds of his age. The House of Secrets. As the gates of Kew Palace slammed shut, King George III ceased to be a sovereign and became a clinical specimen. The most powerful man in the world was now a prisoner of his own doctors. Behind the heavy velvet curtains, a war was being waged, not with armies, but with iron, fire, and humiliation. The physicians of the age, led by the stern Reverend Dr. Francis Willis, believed that madness was a rebellion of the spirit that could only be broken through absolute submission. To them, the king was no longer a human being. He was a wild animal that needed to be tamed. The Iron Mask of Monarchy. The treatments were a descent into a living hell. When the king's frantic talking became too much for his keepers, they strapped him into a restraint chair, a heavy wooden contraption designed to keep him immobile for hours. If he resisted, his mouth was gagged with a silk handkerchief, or worse, he was forced into a primitive straitjacket. The man who had worn the imperial state crown was now forced to endure the machine, a high-backed chair where he sat bound, staring into the darkness, stripped of his dignity and his liberty. Every attempt to assert his royal authority was met with further confinement, as the doctors sought to conquer the king's mind through physical terror. Caustic torture. But the restraint chair was only the beginning. Believing that the king's frenzy was caused by bad humors in the brain, the medical team turned to blistering. They applied caustic Spanish fly ointment to his legs and chest, intentionally creating massive, painful chemical burns. The theory was that the madness would flow out of the brain through the resulting sores. George would scream in agony as the blisters formed, his skin raw and weeping, but the doctors showed no mercy. They purged him with massive doses of emetics and laxatives, weakening his body until he was a skeleton of his former self, a shivering figure in a stained nightshirt wandering the drafty halls of his prison. While the king was being tortured at Kew, a different kind of poison was spreading through the halls of Westminster. The Regency crisis turned the royal family into a battlefield. The Queen, Charlotte, was a woman broken by grief, desperately trying to keep the king's doctors under control. Opposing her was her own son, the Prince of Wales, a man known for his debts, his gluttony, and his cold ambition. He saw the king's agony as his golden ticket to the throne. The prince's supporters mocked the king's illness, while the queen's faction lived in terror that the king would never recover, leaving the empire in the hands of a man who cared only for his own pleasure. A glimmer of purple. Throughout this nightmare, the silent witness remained, the king's urine. The records from Kew mention dark and discolored discharges, a detail that modern science links directly to porphyria. In the 18th century, it was a mystery. Today, it is the smoking gun of a genetic disaster. The neurotoxins in his blood were destroying his nervous system, causing the tremors, the skin sensitivity, and the mental storms. But for the ambitious prince and the brutal doctors, the cause didn't matter. They were the architects of a new reality where the king was merely a ghost, an inconvenient relic of a dying era, locked away while the world moved on without him. By 1810, the battle for King George's mind was effectively over. The man who had once stood as the guardian of the British Empire was now a phantom haunting the corridors of Windsor Castle. The madness had returned for the final time, and this time it brought its siblings, blindness and deafness. Isolated in a world of total silence and eternal darkness, the king lived in a state of perpetual otherness. He was no longer the ruler of a global power. He was a tenant of his own imagination, wandering through his apartments in a long white nightgown, his once manicured beard growing wild and silver. Conversations with the dead. In his final decade, George III became a resident of the past. He was frequently found holding long, animated conversations with people long since dead, former ministers, long-lost friends, and his favorite daughter, Amelia, whose death had been the final blow to his fragile sanity. To those who caught a glimpse of him, they were a terrifying sight. A sightless patriarch playing the harpsichord for an audience of ghosts, his fingers still finding the melodies of Handel while his mind drifted in a void. He was a king in name only, a living monument to the fragility of human reason, while his son, the Prince Regent, finally lived the life of luxury he had plotted for so long. The clinical verdict. On January 29, 1920, the heart that had outlived its own mind finally stopped. But the story didn't end with his burial at St. George's Chapel. For nearly 2 centuries, historians called him the Mad King, dismissively labeling him with bipolar disorder or dementia. It wasn't until the late 20th century that science looked closer at the blue blood of the royals. Analysis of his symptoms, the purple urine, the sensitive skin, the chronic pain, pointed to porphyria, a metabolic error where the body fails to produce heme. This wasn't a mental illness, it was a slow, systemic poisoning of the nervous system. The very DNA that gave him the right to rule was the same DNA that condemned him to a life of torture. The price of the crown. The tragedy of George III serves as a chilling reminder of the true cost of dynastic purity. To keep power within a single bloodline, the royals of Europe played a dangerous game with genetics. George was not an isolated case. The threads of porphyria and other heritable flaws were woven into the tapestry of many houses, from the Stuarts to the Romanovs. The crown, heavy with gold and jewels, was often lined with thorns of biological decay. George III was perhaps the most visible victim of this royal curse, a man who was sacrificed on the altar of a lineage that valued its own survival more than the health of its heirs. Closing. As the curtain falls on the House of Hanover's most controversial reign, we are left with a haunting image. A king sitting in darkness, abandoned by his family and broken by his own blood. He paid the ultimate price for a crown he never asked for, in a body that betrayed him from the start. In the history of power, there is no greater tragedy than a ruler who can command the world but cannot save himself from the poison within. This is the true price of dynasties, where the glory of the throne is always paid for in the silence of the suffering.